I'm Claire Hubble, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, following the news that Putin has offered Ukraine a temporary ceasefire, we discuss the possible motivations for such an offer and whether everything is all as it seems. And we hear of the challenges faced and ensuing resilience and adaptability shown by doctors and healthcare workers in Ukraine's hospitals in an interview with public health expert Oksana Pyzik.
This hideous and barbaric venture of Vladimir Putin must end in failure.
Putin's war in Ukraine has destabilized energy markets the world over.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
Every weekday afternoon, we sit down with leading journalists from the Telegraph's London newsroom and our teams reporting on the ground to bring you the latest news and analysis on the war in Ukraine. It's Thursday, the 6th of January, day 317. And to discuss the most recent events in Ukraine and around the world, I'm joined by Assistant Comment Editor Francis Durnley, Senior Foreign Correspondent Roland Oliphant, and lecturer at UCL School of Pharmacy, pharmacist and Global Health Advisor Oksana Pyzik. I started by asking Roland to explain the ceasefire in further detail.
Right, so as you said yesterday afternoon, the Kremlin suddenly put out a statement, it's about 3 o'clock our time, I think, 3:25, saying that Vladimir Putin had ordered the Russian armed forces to unilaterally cease fire in Ukraine for 36 hours from midday today until midnight tomorrow night, Saturday night, to mark Eastern Orthodox Christmas. Today is Christmas Eve. Tomorrow is Christmas Day by the Julian calendar, which most Orthodox believers in Russia and Ukraine still follow. It was put out by the Kremlin as a response to a request from Patriarch Kirill, who is the head of the Russian Orthodox Church and a close Kremlin ally. It also happens to follow conversations between both Mr. Putin and Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the president of Turkey, and also a conversation between Mr. Erdogan and Volodymyr Zelensky in Ukraine. So this announcement seemed to come off the back of a bit of telephone diplomacy by Mr. Erdogan, perhaps trying to push the sides towards some kind of talks or some kind of compromise. The Ukrainians straight away said, no, nothing doing. This is clearly a kind of an empty jest, a propagandistic sly gambit. We're not going to give you 36 hours to regroup your forces. We're not going to stop hitting your logistics hubs. If you want a ceasefire or you want to talk about a truce, it's quite simple. You get out of our territory, which is basically the understandable response from the side that seems to feel it has the initiative on the battlefield at that. It was also pretty roundly condemned by the usual suspects on Russian War Telegram. You had several of the louder voices on Telegram, people like Igor Girkin, the Military Observer, even Rybar, who are a little bit more muted generally in their criticism of the Kremlin, saying, like, what are you doing? Like, why would you give the Ukrainians 36 hours off? It's crazy. That's nothing new. We've seen a lot of criticism from those tub-thumping pro-war voices on the Russian side, a lot of criticism of the brass since the beginning of the war. So fast forward to today, it is about 3 hours, I think, into the alleged ceasefire, which is meant to begin at 12 o'clock. Well, we have reports from Russian and Ukrainian sources that the Russians have made gains near Soledar, which is one of the towns just north of Bakhmut that's been quite well contested. We've had an air raid alert all across Ukraine. And we've got, I think it's AFP journalists in Bakhmut reporting ingoing and outgoing fire. So no ceasefire, essentially. Now, having been through a few of these ceasefires in East Ukraine and, in the kind of 8-year low-level war that preceded this, it wouldn't surprise me if maybe somewhere along the line there are spots where things have quietened down, where perhaps there are spots where, maybe down somewhere along the line in that more static front in Zaporizhzhia, perhaps. Perhaps there are points where the Russians aren't conducting offensive shelling and maybe the Ukrainians are taking a little bit of a break as well. I wouldn't rule it out, but on the whole, combat seems to be continuing as usual.
Thank you, Roland. And what would you say the purpose of announcing this ceasefire was, seeing as neither side appear to have had any intention of sticking to it?
It's a good question. I think there's there's obviously there's a testing role here, right? I mean, it wasn't going to be a long ceasefire. He said it himself, it was kind of unilateral. And I suppose it tests Ukraine's reactions, it tests the Western reaction to see what kind of traction does that give. The interpretation we got from the Ukrainian government yesterday, Kylo Podolyak was saying, look, there's two kind of objectives. They want to regroup. They're desperate to buy a little bit more time because we keep hitting them. We keep hitting their logistics hubs. We keep stopping them from building these reinforced defenses, all of this stuff. So we absolutely cannot let up. We cannot give them those 36 hours. There's that battlefield consideration. His other interpretation was, look, Putin wants to play the good guy here, and he's hoping that that's going to persuade the European governments in particular to say to Ukraine, well, look, the Russians have ceased fire. Maybe you should cease fire too. Come on, this is an opportunity. Let's get to the negotiating table. And that ends up by de facto freezing the conflict for some time. And suddenly you've got a new line of contact. And there's previous here, right? So he's basically referencing, without mentioning it, the Minsk agreements, which froze the conflict in 2014, 2015, where you ended up with a ceasefire, and then you ended up with a de facto Russian-controlled so-called breakaway states in those occupied parts of Ukraine. And it stayed that way for 8 years. The Ukrainians are convinced the Russians are trying to do that again because they feel that they have the initiative. The Ukrainians feel they have the initiative, and that the Russians are, feeling the pressure at the moment. And there's one other thing I think we should bear in mind. Tatiana Stanova, who's a very, erudite, canny, observant observer of the Kremlin. She pointed out that, first of all, this plays into the way Vladimir Putin sees himself in this war, which is that he is the good guy. He is on the side of light. And look, I am offering a ceasefire over Christmas. I don't know, let's all play football in no man's land or whatever. But also that, look, this comes less than a week after that horrific disaster from the Russian point of view in Makiivka, where the Ukrainians struck that barracks full of dozens, possibly hundreds of mobilized Russian troops, very, very high casualties. And that was an incident that it made waves in Russia. It was noticed, it was picked up. It got play over social media. It's possible, he was trying to preclude something like that happening over Christmas as well. I don't think there is any sign of kind of Russian public morale, the public mood really shifting against this war yet, but incidents like that do have an impact. And the Kremlin is historically, ever since Vladimir Putin has been in power for 22 years, they're absolutely religious about kind of, focus groups, public opinion, or what's the shifting mood. I would be surprised if there weren't, people on Stary Ploshad in Moscow, where the president's administration is, kind of poring over this, thinking, okay, what does Makiivka mean? Is that going to undermine morale? Things like that. I don't think we can separate the two. Those are my immediate thoughts. And just to reiterate, the back of a cigarette packet kind of calculation when it comes to ceasefires is the person who wants a ceasefire is the person who's losing at that time. And I think this does demonstrate that at the moment, it's despite this ongoing grinder in Bakhmut, despite this apparent stalemate on most of the line, it still seems to be the Ukrainians who feel like they have the initiative at the moment.
Thank you for that, Roland. Some really interesting analysis there. Francis, I'm sure you'll have some thoughts you want to share on this ceasefire, so please take us away.
Well, thank you, Claire, and good afternoon to our listeners around the world. Yes, I think I would echo everything that Roland's been talking about there in terms of us interpreting this through the lens of cynicism with regard to Putin's real intentions. I mean, clearly, we've even been speaking on this podcast now for several months that we thought that if things looked like they were in a pretty dire situation from the Russian perspective, that Putin might offer some kind of ceasefire at one stage, even just a brief one, in order to take stock and to appear like the good guy. And indeed, that is what he's seeking to do here. I think actually that's probably the main thing, because it's such a short period. This isn't really about restructuring forces and resupplying. Rather, it's more this appearing to be to the international community an attempt by Russia to de-escalate as opposed to escalate. And if you look at the imagery that the Kremlin have put out in the last 24 hours, it's a sort of smiling Putin in a jumper trying to look a bit festive. And it's clearly a ploy for the optics here to try and win round perhaps those who are wavering in the international community and who aren't following the war as closely as us and our listeners, who think, oh, they see the headline ceasefire and immediately think, oh, there's an opportunity here, as Roland was saying. So I think it's very much important that we see this in the context of this war and what Putin's real attempt is, which is to appear to be in a moral position. I think there's something else that's also important to seeing this, which is that, of course, by the Ukrainians denying this ceasefire, Putin will be able to use that as a means of saying, well, look at how irreligious this Zelensky administration is, despite the fact, of course, that since this war and even before the war, there are many, many Ukrainians in Ukraine who prefer to celebrate Christmas more along the Western tradition of doing it on the 25th of December. So again, there's a sort of religious context to this, which he's saying, well, if you're not wishing to have a ceasefire on Christmas, then what kind of Christian are you? And I think that also plays into this in a way that hasn't really been picked up by many commentators, is that there's a means now that he can use religion as a weapon here, as he has been doing ever since this conflict began, and indeed before that, not only in how they have, the Russian Orthodox Church has depicted Ukrainians since the war, but also more generally now in terms of how it's being used to encourage Russians to fight this state that it sees as being in the throes of Western decadence and atheism as well. So I think that also plays into this. The other update in the military space that I think it's worth talking a little bit more about, and I know that you spoke about this yesterday a little bit, is of course this news that America and Germany and also France are going to be sending further armoured vehicles to Ukraine in, I think it's really important to underline, a major policy shift from Western backers of Ukraine. We already knew, of course, that America was set to announce further support for Ukraine in the military space, but I think that it has caught commentators by the surprise this morning. Not only the policy shift from France in terms of them offering light battle tanks, but also from Germany as well. And I think it's perhaps a sign that there is an increasing recognition in Paris and Berlin that the only option that really the West has now is to provide the weapons that Ukraine needs in order to not only battle back any attempted offensive on Kyiv, which is possible from the Russians, but also in order to launch further offensives in the coming weeks and months. So I think it is important to register this as quite a significant moment. I think also I was quite struck by the remarks by James Cleverly, the British Foreign Secretary, this morning, who said that Britain is also open to sending Ukrainian tanks and evolving its support to Kyiv as they ready their next phase of self-defense. And I just think that that's also quite interesting, that in a sense, I just got a sense from the wording there that Britain's been caught a little bit on the back foot on this. And that, up until now, of course, Britain has been, at least since the very early days of the conflict, and I know things have shifted a lot since then, but it was Britain that really was championing much, much greater military support from within Europe. And I think there are some suggestions that perhaps Britain in recent months has, while certainly been as robust as ever on the matter of Ukraine and requiring Ukrainians' support, that there has been a slowdown in some of the high-tech weapons from the British perspective. I think there are possibly two reasons for that. On the one hand, I think that it's possible that, the Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak, has a lot of other crises that he's trying to deal with, and he is, we understand, somebody who likes to deal with one at a time. And I think that it may just be that this is something that we're just a little bit slower to react in the new year. But no doubt they won't want to be seen as being, losing ground in terms of Britain being seen as a chief, if not the chief champion of Ukraine in Europe. I think the second reason as well why Britain perhaps has been slower to react is the fact that we've given so much up until this point that stocks are low, as simple as that, that it takes time to build this kind of high-tech weaponry. And as I say, there has been some speculation that we have not got the stockpiles to give the Ukrainians. And of course, there's always got to be enough that if things was an event was suddenly to erupt, that that there would be enough for the British Army to use. It sounds like an obvious point, but I think it's important to emphasise that since this war began, the amount of weaponry that has been sent to Ukraine is incredibly significant, and inevitably, there are some European capitals that are thinking, we can't afford to give them too much because we actually haven't been prepared for land war in Europe for a generation or more. We just haven't got the stockpiles. The armies are not prepared. And so this, of course, is another consequence of the war, is that a lot of armies now are going to be expanding inevitably, and that there will be a lot more work being done to create the kind of supplies that are necessary for not only a long war, but if things were to escalate, that's just a sensible thing for any defense secretary, foreign secretary to be doing. So I think also it's just important to draw attention to that as well, that quite two, I think, very important developments in the last 24 hours in that respect.
And now I'm pleased to welcome our guest for this afternoon, Oksana Pyzik. She is the Global Engagement Lead and Lecturer at the UCL School of Pharmacy, as well as pharmacist and Global Health Advisor. She's also Ukrainian-Canadian. So, Oksana, thank you very much for joining us and welcome to the show. Could you just give us an intro to you and the work you do, please?
Hi, thanks very much, Claire. As you've said, my background is, of course, in healthcare. So I am a registered pharmacist, and I work in the global health space. And recently, I have teamed up with the Pharmacists Defense Association to really ensure that we can help send specialized medical products to Ukraine. I have been at UCL and working with UN agencies and NGOs for well over a decade now. And I also was born in Canada but have Ukrainian roots. And that has been a big part of why I've been such a big fan of this podcast as well and been following it religiously.
Lovely to hear it. Thank you for listening. So can you tell us about what you see as the biggest problems currently facing the Ukrainian healthcare system?
Of course, we see that there's been a huge amount of disruption, and this means that there has been loss of staff, damage to infrastructure, huge security concerns, but also mass displacement of the population. So nearly 7 million Ukrainians have moved from east to west, away from the front lines. And this has put a lot of pressure on the healthcare facilities in this region, as well as in the neighboring countries, such as Poland, which has been the country in Europe that has taken the most refugees. Long term, we're talking about lots of problems with trauma and mental health, and that's very difficult to support. And also, we see that emergency care, the fact that now energy grids are being targeted, that even life-saving surgeries, et cetera, there just isn't that reliability, even away from the front line, that these can be done safely because of power outages. It takes some time for the generators to kick in. We've had stories about surgeons using flashlights to try and complete operations, and so there have been huge amount of challenges from getting the correct medicines over there, as well as other massive problems like attacking hospitals. So right now, over 750 hospitals, clinics, health centers, even just medicine storage units have been targeted. And there are rules to war. And these civilian targets in hospitals, that's a war crime. It is in breach of the Geneva Convention.
Do you have any specific stories or not exactly anecdotes, but, situations you've heard of people getting in that might bring the reality of the situation home to our listeners?
Certainly. So in addition to the fact that people can't access some of their medicines. So in many places, they're just, you don't have electricity. Without electricity, you can't have the basics running. But in addition to sort of the frustration of people who are living in these extremely harsh circumstances, when aid is sometimes delivered, we see that these aren't necessarily the products that are needed. And that in some instances, we see that they have been really like excess supplies that have just been dumped in Ukraine. So some two examples that are pretty powerful is that when our chairman of the Pharmacists Defense Association was in the military hospitals, he saw a huge number of containers containing ventilators that the U.S. had sent over, which were left over from the COVID crisis. And not only did they at this throughout the war, that has not been something that has been in short supply, but the UK also sent lorries full of paracetamol, which is a very weak painkiller and not much of use if you're critically injured from a bomb or other type of injury. But they were also 2 weeks away from expiry. So in that aspect, we saw that then we had our colleagues from Pharmacists Without Borders having to, from all different countries, I mean, just use these two examples, but they've come over to help, and their pharmacist skills are actually used towards just destroying products that can't be used or have come through ways that we can't identify or verify the source. So that has been very challenging for not only there is that skepticism from healthcare workers there about understanding the needs, but also that we do need to work more carefully and ask what products, what specialized medicines are actually needed. And my work with the Pharmacists Defense Association, they're working with the Ministry of Health, with the military hospitals directly, so that you can get specialized blood products, IV infusions, a more sophisticated pain medication, and all of these things that otherwise there has been a gap around and is difficult to supply. So I think that when we see just the devastation that is happening all over Ukraine, yes, the heaviest fighting is in the east, but we see that there have been retaliatory strikes in the major cities, and there is that intermittent supply of important products. So we do need to ensure that we still have those essential life-saving medicines, and some of those are not just for emergency acute care, but also things like HIV medicines, tuberculosis medicines, things for high blood pressure. All of these are a struggle to get.
I wanted to touch on, you've mentioned what's being provided that isn't particularly useful, ventilators, nearly expired, paracetamol, etc. What is in short supply that we should be sending, and which countries are actually doing the best job of providing useful resources?
So we see that recently there has been a large consignment from Germany, but also there have been donor partners. So the EU has been very active in supplying funds that then go into partner organizations who are able to purchase these essential medicines for chronic diseases. So, and as I said, some of the products that are needed are, of course, for acute care. So we're looking at blood products, infusion products, antibiotics, IV antibiotics. These are all things that are specialized prescription-only medicines that hospitals need. And then also what we have seen is that in order to reach people faster, because they may be traumatized from attack, they may be too weak to travel. The WHO has also had mobile type emergency care where they come to on site to people to assist them. So certainly expanding that program, which has been successful and has also really, I think, worked well in the sense that it's improvised with the very strong civil society roots and trusting local people more. And I think that's been one of the weaknesses of some of the bigger organizations is that they haven't necessarily, they have their own protocols. There's also risk assessment, and they're not always able to send their people into the most dangerous areas. But that means that they do then need to trust the local people more to help deliver these solutions.
So is that a sort of blocking point, you would say, is that there's not enough trust between the big organisations and the local people, and they only want to rely on their own staff to deliver and administer medication?
Well, it's certainly slower. And so that in that sense, they're not as agile as some of these volunteer groups. Of course, we always do need a structure of governance and transparency. And there are reasons why, and some of them are diplomatic, that they operate in the way that they do. And there really is a place for all different types of organizations to help and play a role. But I think we do need to be empowering more of these agile civil society groups to deliver the care that's needed, because they can get there faster. They know the lay of the land, and they're willing to take the risks that other employers may not permit for their workers. So I think there is definitely an opportunity for that synergy to become closer, and to not just really say take it or leave it. This is how what our protocol is. So I think there is a great opportunity to grow partnerships and how we deliver that with people on the ground who are doing. They're the unsung heroes. They're not getting the credit for the work that they're doing.
And that sort of feeds on nicely to my next question, which is whether you would like to name some of those organisations, and if you have any information on it, how we, the listeners and people who are observing this war from afar and seeing the real devastating human impact of it, can help those organisations.
Certainly. So the Pharmacists Defence Association in particular has been working very closely with Caritas, has been working with Pharmacists Without Borders as well. And I do also have to give credit to the large organizations like USAID, who really have supported by delivering essential products as well. So while, of course, there are always some hiccups and points to learn from, these have been major organizations. And I think the real message here is to ensure that that support is continued. What I think perhaps the public, who has been very eager to help, and I have been so personally moved and touched to see just the extent of how much people care, and just the various types of fundraising and things happening at all different levels, local levels, national levels, and then we, really globally as well. But one of the things that we saw from the work with the PDA is that when people sent boxes of products, again, not really considering what is needed in the area. And they contained clothes and nappies and things like this. And so many people over the Christmas period and very early in the war got together and they sent these parcels. But unfortunately, what they may not realize is that they never crossed into over the Polish border. There's just too many of them. They didn't have the capacity to go through it all. It really just got buried and put in the dump because it's attracting rodents. And I think that, again, there is a strong will to help, and we need to keep that up. But we also want to make sure that we're not creating extra work and disposal of things that can't be used or can't go through. Medicines or specialized products, you can't pop them in cellophane and ship it over. We need to be able to do it through the proper channels because of the risks that are involved. And again, this is really where the strengths shine through of really the logistical and medical expertise that pharmacists are able to contribute. So through the network of charities that the PDA has worked with across Europe, over £2.5 million of funds have been raised specifically for these types of medical supplies. So I would urge the public that the next time that you're volunteering or you want to do something positive, if you're a listener of this podcast, next time, instead of sending a box, look at some of the smaller charities, see what they're able to do. I know that medicines is one angle that absolutely we need over a long period of time. This isn't just going to be through the fighting. We're talking about into the rebuilding of Ukraine stage as well is going to be needed.
I wanted to touch upon the adaptability and resilience of healthcare workers in Ukraine. How are the hospitals and doctors impacted by the energy blackouts, and how are they dealing with it and changing how they treat patients?
And they're doing so much with so little. So again, very impressive, because a lot of staff may have also left, so they have smaller teams to work with. And those that are there are relying on technology to be able to assist them when, we've already mentioned there's all sorts of issues happening from the fact that, how do we get to the people that are immediately injured in like acute emergencies? And it's been amazing to see basically these mobile clinics that rush to the scene of the accidents and be able to support people on site if they may be too frail to take to hospital immediately, and give that initial care. We see that also, again, this is another reason why generators are so important. With the tax on power grids, we need to ensure that that the electricity maintains, but people are still continuing through the dark. They're using whatever resources they have to ensure that they're able to save lives. So again, it's not. It's something that's constantly changing, and it's something that we see the Ukrainians have done extraordinarily well to be able to adapt to really such horrific circumstances.
Moving on to the sufferers of sort of long-term health conditions, for example, HIV/AIDS in Ukraine, they might have had it before the war, or sort of any long-term health conditions. How has their care been impacted by the invasion?
Well, at the beginning of the invasion, it was hard to get the medicines across, but that's now since been stabilized. There were about more than 30 medical institutions that were providing specialized HIV care had to stop their operations because of occupation or just the fact that the building they were in were completely destroyed and logistic chains were broken. And really pre-war, Ukraine was making good progress with treating HIV, with effective use of the antiretroviral meds, which, again, we were getting to a much better place. Is interesting because the HIV treatment regimen in Ukraine differs from those used in the EU. And it includes just other types of drugs, but they aren't licensed in EU countries. So there was some concern about, in Poland particularly, about people continuing to adhere to treatment. But they changed the law and so that these medicines could be licensed. So that's another way to, again, that Poland was able to assist. But on the flip side, where they did very good work on that, it has been very difficult for women who have fled the conflict in Poland because of the more conservative policies to be able to access reproductive care. So we're not just talking about anti-abortion tablets, which again are restricted in Poland, but even just contraception. And so on one hand, there has been huge benefits, but there are also some medical challenges as well.
So just for clarification, because I myself am not clear either, what's the law on contraception in Ukraine and how does that differ to Poland?
So you can get the emergency hormonal contraception more easily, more readily in Ukraine. And in recent times, it's become more difficult and really even in severe instances of much like actually in the U.S., access to abortion medication has become much more problematic.
As for maternity units and resources in Ukraine, how have they been impacted? And I mean, I'm just imagining, for example, being in a blackout and being in labour or having any kind of complication must be so incredibly frightful, especially because it's such an unpredictable and stressful time anyway. What's the situation like there now in maternity units?
And well, we see that again, it really varies in what part of the country you're in and if it happens to be the site of an attack, because so many babies in Ukraine during this year have been born in a bomb shelter. And that in itself is very challenging. People have, again, had to, in power outages, deliver anyways without electricity. So there have been huge obstacles towards what we would consider good quality maternal care. And unfortunately, this does have lasting implications, particularly earlier in pregnancies. We see that stresses that the mother feels leaves an effect on the child as well. So very high stress from constant air raids, attacks, fear, adrenaline, all of these issues can later mean, and these studies have been done previously as well in Holland and looking at in previous wars where mothers who were in stressful conditions, who didn't have access to food, they did a long cohort study to follow the children, and they saw a direct impact on the health of the child, where they were much more likely to develop diabetes and heart conditions earlier than their peers in this cohort study, done in the 40s. So we have the scientific evidence to show that, if you are not even delivering is one aspect, but going through a pregnancy, living in a war zone without necessarily access to consistent water, food, electricity, care, and in high states of fear, that's obviously going to impact the health of the child and the health of the future nation.
Yeah, thank you. It's so interesting to think about how this invasion will impact so many generations to come. Is there anything else that we haven't discussed already that you would like to talk about?
I think I would just emphasize again that today is a Ukrainian Christmas Eve. Some may not be observing it and moving towards the Western calendar, but in the spirit of giving, that if there are people that want to continue to help and make a difference, that funds for these for medicines are one of the most impactful ways to be able to support, and that you could do that by going to medicinestoUkraine.com in any country. It'll be recognized. I know we've got a lot of listeners from all over the world, including Canada, where we have 1.36 million Ukrainian Canadians. So we really appreciate any support that people can offer at this time.
Just picking up on what you were saying there about Canada, we have a lot of listeners in Canada, and I think it'd be interesting because it's not a country we've talked about at length actually on the podcast. Just wanted to get a general sense from you what the reaction was in Canada. You've already talked there about the size of the Ukrainian population diaspora there, but what generally was the reaction in Canada, and what are the particular concerns that maybe are unique to that country when looking at this conflict?
Well, we have something called the Ukrainian Canadian Congress, the UCC, which is the voice for the diaspora. And they have really put a lot of pressure on the Canadian government to swing into action, to enhance sanctions, which are also an important part of how we fight this war, not just on the battlefield, but also who we do business with and how. And Paul Hrod, who was the past president of the UCC and is now the Ukrainian Canadian World Congress president, has really been influential in also not just for asking support from other organizations and countries on the military front, but supporting those that come into Canada. So Canada has also been a popular place for Ukrainian refugees to come and resettle, specifically because of the large Ukrainian Canadian community. And so they've been very involved in terms of integration within schools, helping them to set up for job interviews, really practical. So we look at sort of the high-level lobbying where we're represented through the UCC, right down to the very individual, bringing in people to their family. And of course, many people in the UK and Europe also took in Ukrainians, but it has been to a greater extent in Canada. And our Deputy Prime Minister and Finance Minister, Chrystia Freeland, also has Ukrainian heritage and was sanctioned by Russia already in 2014. So we're very lucky to have, very informed and active leadership within the Canadian government itself.
That's really interesting. And just in terms of coming back to Ukraine itself, it's interesting what you were saying about some of the challenges of procurement. And just wondered whether you go into a little bit more detail about some of the difficulties with perhaps procuring certain medical supplies. And what I'm particularly getting at here is we obviously have had years of lockdowns as a consequence of COVID, and as a part of that, the challenges of international procurement, the competition between different countries in order to purchase certain medical supplies over others, issues around sort of corruption and making sure that money doesn't go wasted. I'm just interested in your general reflections. Are there any lessons that were learned from COVID, or are some of those challenges, have they carried over with relation to Ukraine?
Well, I think it's difficult to apply some of the lessons learned from COVID because one of the major lessons, especially that low and middle income countries learned, is that they need to have their own manufacturing and suppliers within their regions, and that if they don't, they're going to be last in line and totally dependent on donations. And I think that's one of the things that Ukraine will have to be working towards over a long period of time is to ensure that they can be self-sufficient when it comes to defending their territory. And that will be a decades-long project. But with the medicine supply itself, highly globalized. So I think when we look at where the pressures or the bottlenecks exist, it becomes difficult because, of course, countries are going to ensure that they have their own stockpiles first before they send. But I think there is also, to some extent, limitations to which the donation model is effective. So, for instance, some companies like Novo Nordisk, they have foundations, they produce diabetes medication, and so they will send a lot of their medication, like a confinement of that. But then you're really at whims of what is available. So I think that the lessons from COVID were around manufacturing independence. Now, certainly in the region outside of Ukraine, right now, building up a pharmaceutical industry in Ukraine would not be wise, given the level of destruction that's happening. But there is a level of dependency that's difficult to navigate around because it is really through a donation scheme system.
Thank you. Just one more from me, if I may, which is we, of course, every country in the world, and particularly in Europe, has their own long-term health issues. There's plenty in Britain, plenty in France, plenty in Germany. They're all slightly different because of cultural factors and, of course, their own divergent histories. Just wondered that before the war, what was the state of Ukraine's healthcare? What were the long-term challenges in that country that might differ from certain other ones? And then thinking forward, what do you think that after the war, the long-term health impact may be and the challenges that Ukraine will face?
Well, certainly the levels of HIV are highest in Ukraine and in all of Europe. So reducing that burden continues. While it was improving, it still was one of the top priorities within the region, along with tuberculosis, which is, of course, an infectious disease and quite serious and requires some complex medical treatment. You're taking several tablets a day. So we have some infectious disease issues, as well as so oncology and cancer care, palliative care, all of these things, again, needed improvement. And since the war, really, there is palliative care almost altogether has dropped off. And this is a major problem. And transporting oncology patients and continuing their treatment is so critical as well. And that has been one of the biggest challenges. So I think we're going to see, again, an impact of COVID itself. This has been missed cases, people aren't coming to their appointments. So there are 100 million people in Europe who have not had their screening for cancer done. So we're moving outside of Ukraine, but including it, which translates to about 1 million people who have cancer but will have not been diagnosed yet as a result of that. And this is a huge problem. The Lancet just published a report about oncology and cancer care. And interestingly, Ukraine was one of the countries where we had the most clinical trials in oncology. So we're losing a huge amount of research and knowledge stemming out of Ukraine because the studies and the trials were based there. And as a result, that impacts our policies and understanding of the diseases going forward. So in the report itself, it highlights the damage done, not just because, of course, within the Ukrainian population, cancer care has been disrupted and there'll be many more cancer deaths, but as Europe, it affects all of us because it's been one of the research hotspots for cancer.
Thank you for that, Oksana. Before we wrap up this afternoon's episode, Francis, are there any more updates for us?
Well, just a couple that I wanted to touch on. We've talked a little bit about how Canada is reacting to the war in Ukraine as part of this broader conversation about how the world is reacting, even when they perhaps seem on the surface quite geographically removed. And it just brought to mind that there was quite an interesting story that I read this morning about how the Japanese Prime Minister has said that he's told Volodymyr Zelensky in a phone call that he's considering his invitation to visit Kyiv, depending on the circumstances. And whilst nothing's been decided, clearly Tokyo's support for Ukraine since the war began has been very strong. They strongly condemned Russia's aggression. And indeed, I believe sincerely that they are concerned on a moral basis, but they are also, of course, concerned because of issues in the Pacific around Taiwan and instability there from China. So I just wanted to touch on that because it shows again of how the war in Ukraine has geographical, political ramifications, ripples all around the world that we are still only really just coming to terms with, I think. And of course, some of the questions that we've been posing now for several days are around how things could potentially escalate in the long term unless certain things are done. And I think it's important that we are always thinking about this much more widely than just what is going on in Europe, because it does have big ramifications abroad as well. And just one other thing in this sort of diplomatic space, I think it's important that when we see stories on this, we touch on it, is that the Belarusian president, Alexander Lukashenko, visited a military base where Russian troops are stationed, and that's according to the defense ministry. And apparently this is an unnamed representative from the Russian army discussed the two countries' joint military drills, which of course we've spoken about. And I just think we should continue to keep an eye on this because, of course, if, as we understand, is being talked about at quite high levels, there is a chance of there being some kind of renewed offensive on Kyiv, then Belarus would be integral to that. Either it be integral in the sense that, like in the first main invasion that happened in February, that Belarus would be one of the key territories that they'll be launched from. But if they don't proceed and they're not used, then also that would be also relevant. But as things are going on at the moment, it does seem that Belarus is still keen to be working more closely with Putin than perhaps one might hope at this scale of the war. So again, I just wanted to draw attention to that, because if, as we fear, there were to be some sort of major offensive from the Russians in the coming months, then I think Belarus are going to have a role in that. So any news there that involves Lukashenko working more closely with Putin, being involved with drills, those kind of conversations, I think it's worth us touching on. So I just wanted to touch on that before we ended today.
Thank you, Francis. And now we are coming to the end of our time this afternoon. So I'd like to come to our final thoughts. Oksana, what are the main things you would like to leave our listeners with this afternoon?
Well, I think the fact that so many people in Ukraine and really generations will be traumatized by this war, and that's going to be one of the greatest mental health burdens that will not just be limited, I think, to Ukraine. I think Francis was entirely correct to highlight the global implications, and that also matters for health, and not just infectious diseases, but in other ways as well. Because a stronger Europe really brings the whole continent up. And again, just to really ask our listeners to consider how they might be able to play a role and what each of us as individuals can do. So my final ask is for everyone just to even have a look at medicinestoUkraine.com.
Thank you for that. And over to you, Francis, for your final thoughts.
Well, thank you. And of course, in the same vein that Oksana was talking about, I think it's important that we also think about or continue to return, should I say, to the issue of war crimes that have been perpetrated by Russians on ordinary civilians. Obviously, it's something that we've touched on the podcast a lot. And whenever there's news in this space, I think it's, again, important to draw attention to that. And in that sense, there's been some further troubling remarks from the head of the Wagner Group in the last 24 hours. The first batch of Russian convicts that were sent to fight on the front lines have, we understand, been told not to drink too much or rape anyone after being returned as free men in exchange for their services. I mean, just the very fact that this is even a topic of conversation that can be made publicly, I find absolutely extraordinary in the modern age, frankly. But I think it also does speak to the fact that it's clearly being acknowledged that this is going on at the highest levels. Otherwise, one wouldn't talk about it in this way. But also, the manner in which it seems to be being talked about seems pretty casual to me. I mean, the fact that you're putting that in the same sentence as not drinking too much is extremely troubling, and I think does talk to an ingrained culture, certainly within the Wagner Group and in mercenary forces, that is operating on a absolutely different moral level, frankly, than would be acceptable in conventional forces. Although, of course, at the same time, we've seen similar atrocities committed by the Russian army. And I return again to a point made very eloquently for us in our paper by Robert Toombs, which is that one of the most troubling things this war has done has shown that previously perceived things that belonged only in the past, the kind of atrocities that were committed by the Red Army, for instance, in Berlin and in Eastern Europe at the end of the Second World War, were believed to be consequences of the unique, vicious circumstances of the Second World War, which were, of course, absolutely barbaric on the Eastern Front. But most troublingly of all is that it seems there's actually a much more deeper ingrained cultural issue within certain mercenary forces and within the Russian army that enables this kind of behaviour that was not something that was facilitated by the actions of others, but rather it's a sort of a culture, a lack of training, a lack of sensitivity, all of these things that is perpetrating this kind of behaviour and facilitating it and enabling it. And until that is tackled in the long term, then I fear that this is not going to be something that we're going to see change, which is why, of course, it is so vital and so important that the international community remains committed to focusing on the issue of war crimes and bringing those who have done these things to justice, not only on a small scale, but actually something that is seen internationally. And we are talking, I think, in terms of trials at The Hague, and we are talking in terms of something that people can point to, just like we do with Nuremberg, as something that showed that actually certain behaviour is not only tolerated by the international community, but needs to be seen as a cultural moment, a cultural reckoning that everybody remembers for generations to come. Because the danger is if that does not happen, that this kind of behaviour, I fear, will just be enabled in the long term. So just again, whenever a story like this rears its head, I always think it's important to draw attention to it, even if it may sometimes seem quite small compared to the grand scheme of things.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph. To stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, subscribe to The Telegraph. You get your first 30 days completely free at telegraph.co.uk/audio. Or sign up to Dispatches, our Ukraine newsletter, which brings you stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. each weekday on Twitter Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on Twitter so that you don't miss it. If you enjoyed this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app. And if you have a moment, leave a review as it helps others find the show. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing podcasts@telegraph.co.uk. Ukraine the Latest is produced by Louisa Wells and Giles Gear, and today on Twitter, Robbie Nichols.